This video is the bonus section of the last challenge. In this part you'll implement the dice game and dice player classes and score dice combinations for a player's scorecard. You should implement scoring as shown on this slide, which I've shown you in the previous video. This code is implemented as an enum dev.lpa.dice.scored item in the code in the resources section of this video. If you'd rather come up with your own scoring mechanism, that's great too. I'll be using the game player, game action and game console types from the previous Pirate Game Challenge. This code is in the resources section of this video. Dice game should extend game. Sample output for the top level game actions is shown on this slide. Dice player should implement player. Each dice player should have a scorecard with a place for each of the scored items, initialized to an unscored value when the player is created. Hint, I'll be using an enum map for the player's scorecard. The roll the dice action should match what you built in the previous challenge. This means the player should be able to choose to keep the dice, re-roll them all, or pick only some of the dice to re-roll. You can maintain the current dice values as a field on your dice player. Each player must pick the item on the scorecard to use to get a score for their dice combination. Once an item is scored, it can't be rescored, so display only valid unscored items for your player to select from. Sample output for selecting how the dice should be scored is shown on this slide. This should be presented after the user selects enter during the roll the dice action. You can use the supplied enum to score the dice combinations based on the user's selected value or build your own mechanism. I'm using the random challenge project from the last video. I've added the 4 types in the dev.lpa.game package from the resources folder. These include game, game action, game console and player. I've also added the scored item enum, and that's in the dev.lpa.dice package. I'll show it briefly here as we never worked on this previously in the course. I've created it just for this bonus, so you should probably study that code in detail. Next I'll create a new class in dev.lpa and call that main game and add the main method. The first thing I want to do here is to show you how that enum might work. I'll set up a list of dice numbers to do this. I'll manually set this up. I'll add a full house for the test. A full house has 2 of one kind and 3 of another kind, so I'll have 2 2s and 3 4s. Next, I'll loop through all the values in the enum. I'll print the enum constant and the value I get by calling the score method on each enum value. Running this code. For the dice values I set up, I can see that I get non-zero scores for the categories 2s, 4s, 3 of a kind, and full house. The user can only score each category only once. The player has to pick which one to use for the score. A player can't replace a scored item once it's been scored. The next thing I want to do is create a dice player, which I'll add in the dev.lpa.dice package. I'll have this implement the player interface. This doesn't compile. Before I fix that problem, I'll first add 3 fields, the player's name, a current dice list, and an enum map for a scorecard. I'll make all of these private and final. I'll initialize current dice to an empty list to start. I'll use an enum map for the scorecard, and I can construct this with the enum type, so I pass the scored item.class to this. Enum maps are more efficient. In this case, it won't matter much, but I want to just keep this kind of map on your radar. I will generate a constructor next, and for this I'll just use name. I will set up my player's scorecard in this constructor. This means I'm going to create an entry in the map for every value and initialize everything to null, meaning it's unscored. I'll just loop through all of the enum values and put an entry in the scorecard for each value, setting the value to null. Okay, so now if I go up to the dice player class name and hover over that, I can pick implement methods. That generates the only method I'm required to have on this class, a name accessor method. I'll change null to name in that return statement. I'm going to want a toString method, so I'll generate that, picking all the fields. Next I want to implement the roll dice method on this player. It's going to be a lot like the roll dice method from the first part of this challenge, so I'll go to the main class from before and copy the roll dice method on that class. I'll paste it in the dice player class. I'll make this public and remove the static keyword. I'll also remove the parameter. Since current dice is a field on this class, I can simply access it. I don't have a static random field on this class, so instead I'll just call a new instance in this method. Okay, that's just part of the functionality I need, but before I complete it I'll create the dice game next. This will also be in the dev.lpa.dice package. I want to extend the GameAbstract class and use the dice player as the generic type. This won't compile until I include the abstract methods from game. I can hover over the dice game class name and select implement methods. For the create new player method, I need to return a new dice player, so I'll add that. This code still doesn't compile, so if I hover over the error, I see that I need a constructor. I'll select create constructor matching super. To use this game, you may remember I need to set up some game actions. I can use actions already set up on the game class. I'll first remove the return null that's in the getGameActions method and add a new line for some space. I'll create a new map variable which matches the return type of this method. I'll set that to a new linked hash map, so the actions are shown in the order I set them up. I'll include the standard actions from this class's superclass, which are just quit and get information. I'll return this map. IntelliJ is giving me a hint on the putAll method, but I'm going to ignore it for now. I'll be coming back to this method to add an additional game action shortly. I can run this as a game now, though it won't do much. I'll set this up though anyway, in the main game's main method. First, I'll comment out the code that's currently there. Now I'll add the code to test this game out. I set up a console variable, setting that to a new game console and passing it a new dice game. I'll call playGame on that variable, passing it a new player, by calling console.addPlayer. If I run this, I get a working console game that first prompts me for my name, so I'll enter Tim there. Then I can select either Q or I. If I press I, I'll get information about my player, including the scorecard. I'll enter Q and quit out of that. At this point I want to include a game action for rolling the dice, so I'll go back to the dice game and the getGameActions method. First I'll add map.of in the constructor's parentheses, and I'll press enter after the opening parentheses. I'll now set up a game action, so R will be the key. I'll pass the new game action the value R and roll dice as the prompt. The third argument is the action, so I'll use a method reference for roll dice, which I'll implement shortly. The roll dice method will take the player index value and will return a boolean. I'll make this private. It uses game's getPlayer method passing the player's index, and it'll execute roll dice on that player instance. It returns false, so the game continues. Returning true would end the game after the first roll, so we don't want to do that. Okay, so now if I run this code, I'll enter Tim, and now I can see that roll dice, or R, is a new option. I'll enter an R there, and there's my randomly generated dice values. If I press I should see this as the current dice on this player. And sure enough, I can see that the current dice has those same values. I'll press Q for quit. Now, like the first part of the challenge, I want my player to have the same 3 options for re-rolling the dice. But how do I do this using my game console class, which is the keeper of the scanner code? I'll add functionality to game console that will display a prompt and get input, returning that from a method. This needs to be public and static, returning a string, the user's input. It'll take a prompt as a parameter to prompt a user for input. I'll first print the prompt, then scan and return the user's input. Next, I'll jump back over to the main class from the first part of this challenge. This time, I'm going to copy both the pick losers and remove dice methods. I'll paste both of those into the dice player class. For the pick losers method, I'll remove the static keyword and I'll remove the parameter again. I'll also remove the println statement that prints the prompt. I'll next replace scanner.nextLine with a call to the new method on game console, so get user input, and I'll pass that the prompt plus an arrow token. That's all I need to do to this method. I'll go to the remove dice method and remove the static keyword there as well, and the first list parameter. I want to use these in a method that resembles the code I had in the main class main method, meaning the while loop I had there. I'll create a new method on Dice Player, making it public, having it return a boolean, and calling it roll dice and select. I'll set up the do while loop to keep rolling dice until the pick losers method returns a true. I'll return false from this method for the moment. I better scroll up and fix the error on line 65. I need to remove the first argument because I removed the first parameter from the roll dice method. Since current dice is a field on this class, I don't have to pass it around. Getting back to the dice game class, I can change the roll dice method to call the new method roll dice and select instead. I'll just return that result, removing the return false statement after that. Okay, so I'll run this and test it out. I'll enter Tim for the name and select R to roll the dice. I'm now in a nested loop, so I can select some dice to re-roll. I'll do that a couple of times, then press enter, which will bring me out to the main menu. This is now when I'd want to score the hand. I'll be adding this in the roll dice and select method, but I need another method on the Dice Player class. I'll add a method called getItemList. This will get a list of all the unscored items from the scorecard map. I'll use a stream pipeline to do this. I'll get the stream from the entry set. I'll filter, getting only the scorecard items that are null or not scored. Since I want a list of strings, I'll map the key to a string using the enums name method, and finish by returning an unmodifiable list. Next, I need a score dice method on my Dice Player, which returns a boolean. It will be true if a value is added to the scorecard. I will get the available items and assign that to a local variable. I'll create a prompt, much like I did before. I'll call GameConsole.getUserInput with this list. If the user didn't pick anything, I'll return false. I'd next want to make sure that whatever the user enters matches up to one of the enum values. I can do this by checking if remaining items contains the user input. If not, I'll print invalid selection and again return false. Now, I can safely get the enum value from the user input string. I can set my scorecard's value by putting the score I get back from calling item.score. I'll return true because something was successfully added to the scorecard. Finally, I can call this new method from the roll dice and select method, again in a do while loop. I'll print that the user has to select a score category. This loop will continue until something is scored successfully. After scoring, I'll clear out the dice roll. I don't want to always return false from this method though, because I want the game to stop when the scorecard is full. So I'll change my return statement. Okay, that's it. Let's try this out. I'll enter Tim, and then R to roll the dice. I'll just press enter next, so I'm not re-rolling anything. Now notice that I got a list of the scorecard items. Every one of these categories has to eventually get scored. I'll just enter the first option, aces, which will count the number of ones in my 5 dice. If I were really playing, I'd be trying to get the right combinations of dice for the right category. After that, I'm back at the main menu, so I'll press I. What I want you to see is that current dice is empty and that aces on my scorecard isn't null anymore. I'll select R again to get 5 more dice. Again, I'll just press enter to keep this dice combination. The scorecard options are shown again, but notice that aces isn't listed. It's only displaying valid unscored options for me. I'll enter 2s this time, and then I again to see the scorecard. Sure enough, there's a score for that category. I'll enter Q to quit, and won't go through the whole play here, but you should definitely test that all out. If you were implementing this as a competitive game, you'd probably limit the number of times the dice can be re-rolled. I'm sure you'd like to put a user interface on some of these games, and we'll be getting to that. But first, I want to go through a couple more of the basics, so in the next video, I'll be looking at the big decimal class. See you in the next video.